Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. My name is Dr. Clive Werrett. I'm the Vice Chair of the Public Services Group and Chair of the South Midlands branch. I will be presenting the webinar today. So if we can start the presentation, please. Thank you. Right. Yeah, that's me. I've been retired now for just over a year and effectively enjoying retirement, but still keeping my hand in with IOSH and still interested in health and safety. The Grey Fleet is an area where I've been interested for a number of years, simply because it has caused me a little bit of frustration from time to time that nobody takes people driving their own cars for work purposes as a risk. So I'll move on to the next slide. So what's different? Well, driving is accepted as a part of modern living, and the risks are taken for granted by a lot of organisations and ignored because it's a complex activity. We do ask in many instances people to use their own cars because it's a cheaper option than buying cars and putting them and maintaining them, taxing them, etc. But the company itself really doesn't always view the Grey Fleet, as I've said earlier, in a way that is a risk to the business. There may be a bland question in the job application form about the ability to travel, and maybe a few words in the employment contract, but not much else from that. What we need to think about is the increasing number of vehicles on the roads. Now, it's quite interesting that during COVID, obviously, we had a reduction of driving, but now it's getting back to the levels that we saw pre-COVID. For me, driving is not a pleasure, except at night and early morning, because the roads are increasingly congested and parking is really difficult as well. According to government figures, there are 40.3 million licensed vehicles on the roads. And to cope with all the additional traffic, the response has been to, particularly on motorways, to use the hard shoulder as another driving lane. I'll leave you to decide whether or not that's safe or smart, but it certainly helps to ease some of the congestion. With respect to other roads, I seem to see a deterioration, which is faster than they can be repaired. And I think we're all aware in the UK of potholes due to increased use. And with respect to parking, anything goes. Parking on pavements, sometimes totally on pavements, seems to be acceptable, as is parking in disabled and parent-child bays when you're not disabled or you haven't got a child with you. With the summer holidays fast approaching, I will be limiting my driving to close to home. The other thing that we have to be aware of is that there's no sign of road deaths decreasing. We've all seen or been involved in or witnessed incidents whilst driving. And in most cases, the incident may be verbalized or result in minor damage or injury, but there are still too many fatalities. And according to the government, an estimated 15,060 reported road deaths in 2021 and a reduction of 12% from pre-COVID levels. But interestingly, it's up 7% from 2020. Similarly, with those killed or seriously injured, 27,300 in 2021, up 13% from 2020. And overall, that means that there's been an increase in casualties of all severities from 2020 about 11%. And so we need to consider that we're not really tackling the issue of risk of driving. So what does the future look like? And what I'm going to do is put forward my thoughts gathered over nearly 25 years of working in health and safety. It's a topic that has interested me and frustrated me because of the intransigence of some employers to take the Grey Fleet seriously. I'll be looking at big picture aspects, so I'm not intending to cover driving risk assessments and the like. So let's start by looking at the changes that have happened recently. There are 4 that I want to highlight. Fuel prices, I don't think anybody has been immune from that. Petrol and diesel have increased by about 50% in the last few months. And going electric isn't always attractive either because of the increased energy costs. As a consequence, what are people doing? Well, they could reduce their driving, but I see no evidence of that. I have heard that people are refusing to drive for work, and no doubt the unions will be putting mileage allowances on their shopping lists for increased wages. We've also heard the government say that they're going to phase out petrol and diesel cars. So no new petrol or diesel cars from 2030. And unless there's a government U-turn, then we're going to see increasing numbers of hybrid and electric vehicles on the road. But if you've had a look at the prices, they are significantly higher than a similar model in a petrol or diesel form. We'll have to see whether or not that trend to move to hybrid and electric continues in the future. COVID-19, there's 2 points here really. Work habits. So working from home is a viable alternative now to commuting to an office, but I have noticed that employers are encouraging people to drive into the offices. Whether this is something to do with control. If you can't see people working, do you know that they're working? But there's still a need for people to get to meetings where a face-to-face encounter is required. The other aspect of COVID-19, which we're probably all partakers of, is the increase in home deliveries of either food or goods. Ordering line might have removed the need for people to drive, but has increased the number of vehicles on the road, particularly vans, and the gig economy where people use their own vehicles. It might be an area where there's a useful topic to be researched. Okay, so we'll move on. I should say that if you've got any questions, you can either put them in the chat, or you can put them in the Q&A box, please. And if there's time, we'll get round to answering some of them, but we'll give a full answer once the webinar is finished and through the IOSH website. Just going to touch now on the law. I think no matter where you are, we have employers and employee duties. And I think this needs to be looked at with respect to driving for work. It is a work activity, and there need to be policies, procedures, and risk assessments in place for both the fleet, company vehicles, and the grey fleet, people using their own vehicles. And don't forget volunteers. I've been involved in looking at volunteers, and most times they can claim mileage allowance, so they are probably doing some driving for the activity that they're volunteering for. And if the company or organization is paying for that, then there is a duty of care for the volunteer. Prosecutions, and I think this is an area where probably organisations and companies go, well, there's no evidence that there's a risk from driving for work because there's not many companies being prosecuted, and that's true. You can look on the Health and Safety Enforcement and Prosecutions database in the UK, and you'll find very few. And that's mainly because RTAs, RTCs, road deaths are normally a matter for the police. Although we are aware that the HSE do get involved if there is work aspect. Whether or not the employer knows about it is interesting, because if it's a private vehicle, it's likely that the insurance companies will sort out the details, and unless you have a good reporting culture, it's unlikely that the accident will be reported. I must admit, I have seen some really harrowing dashcam footage from employees involved in our RTCs when we have had an accident report. And this really should highlight to managers that there's a risk there that needs to be managed. The other thing that's changed just recently, as recently as last month, is that there's been a change to the sentencing guidelines with respect to dangerous driving and causing a death to a person by dangerous driving. If you're under the influence from drink or drugs at the moment, in the UK, it's 14 years imprisonment as the maximum sentence. Under the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill, which reduced in April, the maximum sentence is increased to life imprisonment. Hopefully, and I think this is what the government hopes, it will be a deterrent for individuals thinking about driving whilst under the influence, but it's also incumbent on employers to ensure their drivers, both the fleet and the grey fleet, that they're informed and know that there's been a change, because it will impact on policies and procedures. And if you don't do this, then is there a tacit acknowledgement that staff possibly could drive under the influence of alcohol or drugs? And I'll leave that one for you to think about and maybe take back to your employees. So we'll move on to the next topic, which I find quite interesting, because at one point I was driving company cars, where I didn't really think about insurance. When I then went to management cars, so the company was providing me via a lease arrangement, then obviously I had to think about insurance there. But these days, most people are registered as a keeper, and they do not own their vehicles. So that means that the vehicle finance arrangements come into play. And there's 4 areas where, as an employer, having people use their own vehicles, or vehicles owned by the finance company, maybe, there's an issue to know what type of insurance they may or may not have. So if you're on a purchasing agreement, which is a bank loan, PCP, or hire purchase, then obviously you won't have insurance included in the finance arrangements, and you will have to make those arrangements yourself. Similarly, with a car that's leased, you will have to make your own insurance arrangements. But we also should be aware that in both cases, there is likely to be a limit on annual mileage. So this may incur penalties if people go over their annual mileage, and it's one thing which might rebound on employers if they ask staff to do excessive mileage. So I think there's something there to consider, but it's not necessarily going to be an issue unless there is a huge call on a person to drive for work. The other two types of vehicle ownership are subscriptions and motability, and in these cases both have insurance included in either subscription or the payment that you make under the mobility allowance. So basically, I think you need to, if you like, have some idea of how people are financing their cars and whether or not the insurance that's included, particularly on the latter two, that we have business insurance included, because it is important. Otherwise, the employee is not covered. Right. Let's move on to the vehicle itself, please. Tax and MOT. With 40.3 million cars on the road and a further 700,000 unlicensed vehicles on the road, that suggests that there's quite a large income for the government, but also quite a big problem. Particularly when you look at the figures for MOTs. There's about 35 million tests for class 3 and 4. So these are cars and and minibuses in the UK in 2021. And there was a failure rate of nearly 30% on the first test, which is really worrying. It does suggest there's something wrong there. And then 25% after the retest. So, you know, what does this say about people's attention to maintenance, for example, how they keep their cars on the road? I'd like to be able to probe a little bit more into why there is a failure, but the government website doesn't give you that option. But it could be simple things like tires. But it does argue that maintenance costs and tires, etc., servicing may be a cost too far for some people. And again, we should question whether or not this is an issue that employers should be looking at for grey fleet drivers. The other thing that I'd like to say on the vehicle is it fit for purpose? Now, you could say that a vehicle which doesn't have an MOT, isn't maintained well, isn't fit for purpose. But what I'm looking at here is whether or not the vehicle is suitable for the task. Now, most vehicles will be, but I am aware that in some instances, particularly when there is bad weather, then the type of vehicle that might be used, say, in a social care setting, might not be sufficient for the conditions. And we've certainly experienced, or I certainly experienced when I was working, that transporting service users during heavy rain or snow can cause problems if the car isn't equipped. For example, having summer tires on snow about 4 inches deep is not a good idea. You don't get much traction. And similarly, having a car which isn't high off the ground can cause problems when driving across flooded roads. So really, this is something for the manager and employee to deal with, and it needs a risk assessment and possibly ongoing dynamic risk assessments by the employee when they're undertaking the task. Right, let's move on and have a look at employment contracts. A question for you, which is rhetorical. How many employment contracts specifically detail driving for work using an employee's own vehicle? My guess is that it's not many. most employment contracts that I've seen have the catch-alls like ability to travel, but few are explicit in saying that you will be required to use your own vehicle. But it is implied if there are other things in place like mileage allowances. Does it matter? Well, I think it might do, because with increasing fuel costs, and there seems to be a reluctance to increase mileage allowance, people may say, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to use my vehicle for work purposes. Now, there are alternatives such as public transport, such as cycles, even in city centres, such as the electric scooters that we see. And some companies might have pool cars or hire cars. But I think it's something for employers to think about with respect of how are they going to get people around their patch if there is a need and it can't be done virtually. So again, something to think about, something which maybe isn't on the table at the moment but needs to be. Insurance, well, again, we're coming down to the fact that do we need to check people's insurance, or is it just a case that we expect people to be open and honest with them when they sign a disclaimer when they're claiming mileage allowance? That's all very well and good, but do they have the right insurance even so? If you just say to an insurance company, I want business insurance, they might just say, okay, fine. And it just covers commuting to work. Doesn't cover transporting people, doesn't cover hazardous goods, doesn't cover even traveling to meetings. So it really is useful for some information to go out to employees about the levels of cover they need. And it's not expensive if they do it at the time of renewal. Obviously, during an insurance term, there will be a charge for updating the insurance policy. But at renewal, usually you can tack on business insurance without having a cost. Licenses, right. Again, checks. Checking insurance, checking MOT, checking car tax, checking licenses. Is this something that you really want to do? Small companies, maybe. Individual units within a larger organization where there is a greater risk, say in social care, or where it may be that you're transporting some sort of hazardous material. But again, are we going to be reliant on the employee being open and honest with us? There are things like GDPR that we need to consider, and a self-declaration will get you around that. But we also have to consider that there are some foreign nationals who come to the UK and they can drive with their overseas license for a year in the UK. So it may be something that we need to check as an employer if they have changed their license to a UK license after 1 year. Right. Mileage allowance. Talked about this a little bit already. There has been this big escalation in fuel prices, but mileage allowances haven't caught up yet. I was talking to a dealer just recently, and he was saying that he can't see mileage allowances going up anytime soon until fuel prices stabilize. So if mileage allowances aren't covering the costs of driving, then like I said, we have got employees refusing to use their own vehicles. So again, it's something for the for companies to consider, but also What happens if you do get a refusal? Do you actually discipline somebody? Well, this comes back to the employment contracts. If you haven't got a specific employment contract, how can you take action against an employee? So I think this, again, you know, the field is becoming quite wide open these days. In recent years, about driving for work and whether or not we have in place, employers have in place the right procedures. Mobile phones. This one is a late addition due to an experience I had this morning. My guess is that you do have a policy on mobile phones and it covers the use whilst driving. This is another example of a tacit acceptance that people will drive their own vehicles. Again, comes back to whether the employment contract, but I think it argues that organisations do perceive, because there is law about mobile phone use while driving, that there's a risk there. So again, you know, the ability of people to see risk is something which I think needs to be looked at. The incident that I was referring to this morning was a car that I caught up with, which was weaving jerkily across the road. It nearly hit the verge twice and narrowly missed an oncoming lorry. I did think of drugs and drink at first, but the driver then took a selfie of herself while driving. And she continued to use the phone for several miles, to the frustration of the drivers in the queue behind her. How do you deal with that? Very difficult. Again, as an employer, probably not a major problem unless it results in an incident which does involve the employer. Moving on further, we'll have a little look at an area which, again, is something which I think employers are aware of, but not necessarily doing much about. Employee health. As you will probably know, the focus is on well-being at the moment, and there's an emphasis on mental health. I've seen it myself, and I do think that we need to be aware that physical health and mental health are linked, and we shouldn't just focus on one and not the other. We know that performance and productivity are affected by health issues, which includes alcohol and drug use and abuse. So I'm talking prescription drugs as well as other forms of abuse. If employers are asking staff to drive for work, what about the checks that they do on fitness to drive? A company with fleet vehicles will regularly monitor their drivers' health and will include an annual health check by a doctor. Usually, not necessarily, but there will be some provision in place. Grey fleet drivers, reliance is placed firmly on the employees to declare any health issues and, if necessary, stop driving and surrender the license where appropriate. I used to manage an occupational health service, and I recall that we had several instances where occupational health found a medical condition which entailed the employee to surrender their license. As the employer, we could not allow that member of staff to continue driving, and obviously they were very reluctant to give up their license. I suppose the thing is that occupational health don't necessarily divulge medical information to the organization. which is a bit of a problem. But in this case, we did actually pass the matter to HR to resolve. But it is something that you need to be aware of, because there are a number of medical conditions which are quite common, which will need you to give up your license. And in the UK, if you go onto the gov.uk website and under the DVLA, you can find out a great deal about medical conditions that affect driving. There are 3 circumstances where you must give up your license. So where a doctor tells you to stop driving for 3 months or more, a medical condition affects your ability to drive safely and is lasts for more than 3 months, and you do not meet the required standards for driving because of your medical condition. So typically we're talking things like diabetes or taking insulin, fainting episodes, heart conditions, possibly when you're fitted with a pacemaker, sleep apnea, epilepsy, strokes, glaucoma. The website actually gives quite comprehensive details on other medical conditions that might affect driving. Like I said earlier, we are dependent with the grey fleet on the information that we get from an employee's health screening, if you're doing that. Other situations, you may not know whether or not an employee is fit to drive, but it's something that you need to be aware of, because obviously the consequences both for the employer and the employee might be fairly serious. Alcohol and drugs, a touchy subject, really. I know that we invited a company that specialized in screening to deliver a presentation for us on alcohol and drugs. And they suggested that on a Monday morning, 20 to 25% of employees were still under the influence of either alcohol or drugs following the weekend. We did consider in outline screening, but there are so many objections for doing this, and I think you have to be pretty robust and have the unions fully on board to even start to attempt any sort of alcohol or drug screening. But apart from driving for work, there is a performance and productivity issue. And I think you should think more widely about prescription drugs, for example. Painkillers, yeah, great, but they do affect performance. It's well documented, and there's quite a lot of research into that. So, you know, as a company, do you want employees to be driving for work, making errors in, say, spreadsheets, using machines, when potentially they have either a health condition or alcohol and drugs in their system, which really could affect their work? And this comes on nicely to health screening. What do you do? Well, I expect most of you do pre-employment screening, but how do you continue out forward? And in my experience, as I said, managing occupational health, it's usually only those employees with a chronic health condition or a disability that come to see you. It might be that you get referrals from persistent or employees who are taking regular days off But usually that might be something other than a medical condition or a alcohol drug use. So I think it's again something which employers need to look at and consider what they need to do. The only downside is that there is a cost involved, but one of the easiest ones, which I would certainly recommend, would be eyesight, because you have employees going for sight tests. I don't know what scheme you use. It could be that you use local opticians. It could be that you buy somebody in, or you could do it yourself through occupational health. But one of the things that you should consider is people's long sight. Not just the sight they need for DSE use, but is the sight they would use for driving actually meeting the standard, being able to read a number plate at a certain number of yards. Okay, right, I'll leave that one for you. Moving on to what's the last slide in the presentation, apart from the summary. Do we need more control? My spin on this is yes. It is a risk thing, and there is a risk to the employer as well as to the employee. So driving a vehicle is a risky business. It's getting more risky because of the number of vehicles on the road, and if I can say so, the standard of driving appears to be worsening as well. Placing all the responsibility on the employee might be appealing because it reduces the administrative burden, but actually, does it tackle the risk? I don't think so. And I think employers cannot ignore their responsibilities where they are asking people to drive for work, and where it may put other people at risk. So I think that my presentation so far has highlighted that there are a lot of areas where you need to be looked at, not necessarily actioned, but certainly considered. And I think that this leads on to what we should be doing, which is an organisational risk assessment. So if we could go back, please. Back one slide. Yep, organisational risk assessment. This is something which I don't think many organisations cotton on to. I was talking to the HSE a few years ago about stress, and this was before COVID. What they were saying was that they were thinking they'd been doing a lot of work on stress, visiting organisations, and the one thing that they were finding was organisations were very good on individual stress risk assessments, but they weren't tackling the big issues. They weren't tackling stress at an organisational level, and they did say that that was one thing that they might be looking for in the future. And I think driving for work is another one of these cross-cutting organisational activities that needs an organisational risk assessment. So it needs to be looked at in the round. The wider context is that it covers core subjects which are in the IOSH competency framework and will be expanded on in the soon to be released Blueprint 2, so there's strategy, planning, leadership and management, apart from the obvious driver risk assessments which were done at a local level. So just think about it. Think about what you need to do to put together an organizational risk assessment. For small companies, that's going to be fairly simple and straightforward. For a large company, which has got many varied activities, then yeah, you have to think about all those people that might be asked to drive for work. So it's going to be those administrators, um, those people who may only drive on very few occasions, but are asked to do so. And when you have your organizational risk assessment, you can then present it to the policymakers, the board, the senior management, and highlight where there are weaknesses in your management of the risk. And hopefully, like I say, most of what I've said today will help you to produce an organizational risk assessment that will help to better manage the grey fleet. So if we can move to the last slide, please. So in summary, driving for work is commonplace and is overlooked in most cases as an organizational risk. Responsibility for the vehicle, health and documentary aspects are often left to the employee to confirm. And the question mark there is, what is the employer's responsibility? Changes such as fuel prices, manufacturing of vehicles brought about, and those brought about by COVID-19 will affect driving for work. So virtual meetings, expansion of deliveries, etc. Employers do need to be more knowledgeable and cognizant of driving for work, and organizational risk assessments are required and should be used as the basis for determining an organization's approach to driving for work. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. I hope you found that informative. And we'll just have a little look to see what questions have come in and if we can answer them directly or we need to put answers later on. Thank you. Okay, I'm not able to get the Q&As up at the moment.
Okay.
So if we could,
I'll go through those.
okay,
right.
thank you, Ben.
So the first question that we've had from Nathan here is, do you think that an employer would be liable if they have an employee in their own car driving for work and they cause an accident on the road?
That is something which will depend very much on the circumstances. I'm sitting on the fence here because, as you will have heard, there's not been very many prosecutions. I think it has to depend on whether or not, or what the driving activity was. So, for example, I would say that if you had an accident which involved the transportation of, say, people in social care and they were injured, then I would say the finger is very much pointed at the employer to say, what checks did you do to ensure that those people were safe? If you were transporting some form of hazardous goods and there was a spillage that affected people, again, you may see that the question would be asked, what precautions did you take to make sure that those goods were safe in that vehicle? So it is going to depend on the circumstances, but like I said, experience shows that if it's just a vehicle involving the person driving and it's usually an issue for the insurance companies and doesn't necessarily get reported to the employer anyway.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay.
Fantastic. Yep. So you may have already covered this one, but how do you define excessive mileage?
Excessive mileage. Well, if you look at most PCPs on lease agreements, they're usually about 10 to 12,000 miles per year. So if you factor in that people will be driving for social, domestic and pleasure purposes, and maybe putting sort of 8 to 10,000 miles on their car anyway. And on top of that, you're factoring in having to drive for work. It could push the limits. And then it's down to whether or not at the end of the PCP agreement or the lease, the mileage is excessive as viewed by the finance company, and they have charges that will apply. So again, it will depend on the circumstances, how much is social, domestic and pleasure, and whether or not the excess mileage is due to driving for work purposes. So there might be a balance there that has to be struck.
Okay, great. And another one actually from the same
Any
person,
more, Ben?
Andrew here. He mentioned you mentioned that maybe employers should consider the condition of the vehicle, for example, tyres. Isn't the 45p per mile support also a contribution to these costs?
It is. But like I said, with the increase in fuel costs, it is likely that mileage allowances will not cover all the maintenance and service costs. So you could see a situation. I noted this morning that there seems to be a reluctance for petrol stations to go over the £2 limit, but for diesel. But you could see a situation where the fuel price does increase to £2.20, £2.30 per litre, and the mileage allowance just will not cover the fuel costs alone, and then people will be maybe struggling to find maintenance and servicing costs.
Okay, great. There's a couple of questions here. I'm going to kind of link them together.
Yep.
So again, it comes back to employers. The first one being, can they define what vehicle that people use for work, and also can they make it mandatory for grey drivers to have their vehicles serviced in line with the manufacturer's servicing intervals?
I would say if there is a specific clause in the employment contract, then the employer might be able to assist. And I say might because, after all, it is a private vehicle and people have freedom of choice. In those sort of circumstances, I would say it would be much better for the employer to arrange some sort of lease hire agreement, which if you like, the employee buys into, or to provide a hire vehicle for those times when that particular type of vehicle is needed.
Okay, excellent. Now, someone put here, road rage from occupational driving is often missed when driving your own vehicle. Can you give any sort of further advice around that comment?
Well, having experienced road rage myself, I think the best way of dealing with it is just to be passive. Don't react. Don't start throwing comments back, because that only inflames the situation. Be passive. Let them have their say, and when they've finished, just move on. I mean, it may cause your blood pressure to rise and you may feel like venting, but if you vent when they're not in the vicinity, it's going to be a lot safer than if you vent to them directly. So yeah, I would say take a passive approach to road rage. You don't have to accept what they're saying. You might not like it, but you don't inflame the situation and it doesn't escalate.
Okay, great, thanks. And just going back to, so you spoke about employment contracts with the previous question that was mentioned, and someone's asking, can't a company have whatever rules it wants put into a separate driving for work policy and then enforce that servicing, etc., if mileage claims are going to be paid?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because in my world, having a policy means that you've got to do things. But if you haven't tied the employee into a formal agreement of some sort to say that they will comply with that policy, then it is difficult. I mean, fairly obviously, a lot of policies are predicated on the employment contract, and when you sign up to it, yes, that's taken for granted. But driving for work is one of these things which, like I said, is only a sort of either tacit agreement when you claim mileage, or it's vaguely specified in your employment contract. So I think there is something here where it needs to be more specific, so that the employee knows exactly where they stand on things. But it's convenient for employers to have a loose arrangement. And yeah, so again, there are alternatives if people have to drive for work. When I long time ago, back in the 80s, when I worked for a chemical company, they wouldn't allow us to use our own cars. They provided a car if we needed to drive somewhere. So again, it comes down to the amount of driving that needs to be done for work, and whether or not the company can offset the costs against whatever mileage allowance they have.
Okay, great. So a question has come in with regards to picking up passengers.
Yep.
Not necessarily work colleagues either. These passengers. So are there any kind of issues if someone is out, they're driving for work, but they pick up a passenger whilst they're doing whatever driving they're doing, and then they claim on the travel expenses? Are there any issues with doing something like that?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a good one. My own view is that if you're driving for work, you're driving for work. You're not driving for any other business. So picking up a passenger and then ferrying them to wherever is not driving for work, and you should not be claiming mileage allowance. But it's the same as if you're out driving and you need to get something for lunch and drive to a local supermarket. Is that okay? In a way, there is a way around that for employers, which is if people are driving from one fixed location, i.e. their office, to another fixed location, there's nothing to say that you can't have a standard mileage for that journey. And so people can only claim for that mileage. If they do more mileage because they've done something else, then basically it won't be recognized. So there's a set mileage, you get that. If you've done excess mileage over that, you don't get the mileage allowance for those miles. But again, it's an employee's conscience.
It's having a start and an end point, isn't it? So
It
your
is, yeah.
start of your journey and the end of your journey, and whatever the shortest or your most common route is going to be, that should in theory basically be all that you claim for. So if you take a bit of a diversion to do something, that shouldn't incorporate into it.
Yeah.
Is there a legal element there? I mean, sorry, not a legal, an insurance element. Sorry. From the perspective of if there was an accident, for example, whilst said passenger was in the car.
I don't think it's necessarily an insurance aspect. I think it's a fraud aspect. Because if you are doing something which is not associated with work when you are meant to be working, and you're claiming monetary recompense for doing that, then it's actually a fraud because you're claiming money when you shouldn't be. So it's, like I said, down to the employee's conscience, down to their honesty. But I think if you do have fixed mileages and for certain journeys, that does tend to stop that thing happening.
Okay, great. We've got a couple. We've got a little bit more time. We do have a couple more questions. I'm just quickly also going to launch a poll just for our listeners. If you wouldn't mind taking a few moments just to complete that. If you don't get access to the poll, it's likely due to the device you're using. Jill has come in. She unfortunately she joined a bit late, but she's hoping that you could repeat the information that you gave surrounding volunteers.
Yeah, volunteers. Basically, if a volunteer can claim mileage allowance, then, if you like, they shouldn't be treated any differently from an employee or a worker when it comes to driving for work. You may want to think about some sort of check on them. I wouldn't necessarily go the whole hog, but certainly if they are driving for you, are you comfortable that they're doing that? And what do you need to make you comfortable? So it may be that you just say not interested, and then you just accept that a volunteer is going to use a car and claim mileage honestly, or you may want to say, well, yeah, you are volunteering, you're going to be driving service users around, people around, so we do need a check on your insurance and your on your license, for example. So again, depends on circumstances, but certainly if they are claiming a mileage allowance, I would be wanting to associate some sort of checking with the activities that they're doing.
Okay, great, fantastic. So just a final question, and this relates to courier services, more specifically, not dedicated courier services. So obviously in scenarios where a courier is collecting various things from various organisations, would that courier service be considered under the control of any specific organization? What happens if there is an accident, during a courier?
Yeah, my answer really is: are they self-employed? If they're self-employed, then that's it. They're self-employed. But if they're employed by a company to do that courier work, then the company will have some responsibility because they're asking them to undertake journeys for them.
Excellent. Okay, well, hopefully that answers that final question there, which brings us very nicely to the end of our hour, actually, which is fantastic. So I'll just hand back to you, Clive, if you've got any last minute summary or comments that you want to make before we close this down. Otherwise, from my perspective, fantastic webinar.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you at future IOSH webinars. Thank you.